Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices, and we are happy to welcome to the program Maggie Anders. Maggie, this is your first time joining us on the show. Take a moment, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. My name is Maggie. I work at the Foundation for Economic Education as a writer and host, and I run a sub-brand of Fee called Undoctrination, where I analyze culture through a free market economic lens.
Oh, I love it. And I love the Foundation for Economic Education. Wonderful people and so
Mhm.
much good information. And I have to admit, this article I'm looking at that was published in the Orange County Register, you are the author of this article titled Americans Are Hungry. Gluttony is on the menu. My first instinct was, oh, we're going to be talking about all you can eat buffets and why are Americans so overweight? But no, it's kind of a different spin on gluttony. Set the stage for me. How do we approach this topic?
Absolutely. So I wanted to write about this topic really using the grocery store chain called Erewhon, which is Los Angeles based, as a conduit through which to talk about a series of emerging crises affecting the American people. Erewhon, for those who are unfamiliar, is kind of infamous for their overpriced luxury health forward goods. So the $19 strawberry. It's a single strawberry, but it claims to be the most perfect
Wow.
strawberry in the world. Or the 45.99 jar of organic pistachio spread, or the 20+ dollar celebrity smoothie collaborations. I mean, this store is infamous for just being super overpriced, and yet it is infamous. And a lot of people are now shopping at Erewhon. But what really intrigued me was that Erewhon's popularity began taking off around 2022. The other thing that happened in 2022 was we started to see skyrocketing prices of groceries. More and more Americans having to pay for groceries with their credit cards, more and more Americans using buy now, pay later schemes to pay for groceries, and more Americans, 18 million households, in fact, reporting being food insecure. So I wanted to dig into why this grocery store chain was gaining so much popularity, why so many people were going and shopping there during a time when it seemed like Americans were struggling to make basic ends meet.
So when I hear about those incredible prices, and I'll admit those are eye-popping prices, I think, oh, well, this must just be for, the Hollywood elite or people who are so rich that they don't have to ask the price. But you point out in your article, there are actually people from a number of different parts of the financial
Mhm.
strata who like to shop there. What brings them?
Yeah, so I think what first attracted people there was the TikToks that exploded from Erewhon. So people trying the smoothies, trying the $19 strawberry. Food, especially luxury food, has become almost a status symbol, a way to display wealth by consuming it. And it's an accessible entry point to luxury for people during a time when they can't afford the normal status signifiers like a home or a car. This has been well documented throughout several economic crises. One guy, Estee Lauder, or Leonard Lauder from Estee Lauder, termed this the lipstick index. Women were buying more lipsticks during financial downturns because it was an accessible entry point to luxury, something that makes us feel better when we are suffering from hard economic times. And I think Erewhon has become something like that. But what's really interesting about Erewhon specifically is that it's food. So food is super impermanent, right? You buy it and you consume it almost immediately. And you don't do that with Sephora lipsticks, right? Those last a little bit longer. Food also accesses this super primal part of our brain. I like to pose in the article that you think of yourself as a caveman next time you walk into a grocery store, and suddenly your urge to shop and buy all of those like crazy processed foods in the middle of the aisles makes a lot of sense, right? So we're still, in my opinion, food obsessed. I think Erewhon is a way for people to be food obsessed but feel a little bit better about it because they're buying less, spending more, And they're basically prioritizing quality over quantity, but they're still over consuming. So it still scratches that overconsumption itch that I think a lot of Americans have today.
Well, and as you point out in the article, they have the added excuse of, and it's healthy. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm dropping 19 bucks for a strawberry, but hey, this is a healthy organic strawberry. So who could blame me?
Yeah, absolutely. And obesity is impacting over 50% of Americans right now, I think. So Erewhon is really interesting and compelling in that we are now trying to actually address the obesity epidemic. We're also in the age of Ozempic and Monjaro and these other weight loss drugs. And so again, Erewhon is a way for people to overconsume in a different way. And that's why I think it's almost gluttonous, not to say you shouldn't shop at Erewhon, but I think Americans in general have a problem with gluttony and with telling themselves no. And that's really a muscle that I'm trying to work personally, is telling myself no when I want something. And I think other people should too, because when we don't do that, we often blame these big scary systems for our problems. I'm overspending because influencers on TikTok told me I had to. It's like nobody's forcing you to buy clothes from TikTok shop or spend $19 on a strawberry, right? That's like your own impulse to use spending as an emotional salve.
And that was one of the things I also wanted to ask you about. You mentioned, food porn, social media, and I've been guilty of this. If I grill a particularly nice steak, ooh, that I got to get a picture of that, on social media. My friends need to see this, and it's not so much a flex of look how rich I am, although steak is
Mhm.
kind of getting up there. But I'm curious, does social media drive that? Whatever it is, does it help scratch that itch for approval or to show that look, I'm conspicuously consuming?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting is that Erewhon rose in popularity on TikTok. This similarly on TikTok, a new trend is emerging, which is trying to fight overconsumption by doing things like anti-hauls, saying what you're not going to spend money on. So there's kind of a war happening within people's hearts and minds, as well as on these social media platforms that we traditionally see people flaunt their wealth or flaunt how much they're spending and what they're buying, where people know that they're over consuming and want to fight it. And I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. I do think a lot of them blame capitalism or big, you know, these big systems that they think are keeping them down for their overconsumption problems. But again, I do think that the war is truly happening within ourselves. And when we respond to financial crisis and economic downturns by spending to self-soothe, we end up harming our future, right? We end up harming ourselves in the long run. And so I think the message of the article was to think a little bit more carefully about what we spend money on.
There's a term you use in here that I just love, and that's it allows us to appear mindful as we commit financial self-harm. That financial self-harm, ooh, that one hits home. We're
Mhm.
down to under a minute here. Can you give us a nudge in the right direction for a person who says, okay, I want to be in charge of my appetites? What's a good way to start?
I think a good way to start is simply by looking at what you're spending money on and asking yourself, am I doing this because I'm hungry? Am I doing this because this is what I need? Or is this giving me a dopamine hit to buy this thing? Because I think for a lot of us, we do kind of let our purchasing be guided by dopamine and what's going to give us a lot of satisfaction and pleasure. And thinking more about what is a necessity, using things up before you buy a replacement is a great tip that I've seen floating around on the internet.
Again, we are talking with Maggie Anders. She's a writer and host at the Foundation for Economic Education, as well as a Young Voices contributor. Where can people find you on social media?
Absolutely. You can find me on X at Maggie Moda. You can find me on other platforms under that name as well. And you can find me on YouTube at undoctrination_fee.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Brayden Myers back to the program. Brayden, you've been on here before, but for those meeting you for the first time, take a moment. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Of course. First of all, thank you for having me again, Brian. It's always a pleasure. So my name is Brayden Myers, and I'm a student studying economics, philosophy, and history at the University of Alabama. I've also done some work in tax policy, which is what we're going to be discussing today. So super excited to talk about that.
Yeah, I was looking at your article on Real Clear Markets. America's youth should be free to innovate without barriers. And this is a subject that's really near and dear to me just because I've seen one too many stories about, for instance, police shutting down a little kid's lemonade stand, right? You don't have the proper permits and whatnot. And I think, boy, that is just sending a totally wrong message. Talk to me a little bit about what has been done in the state of Missouri that seeks to address the problem of too many barriers to young entrepreneurs who want to enter the market.
Absolutely. So first of all, very few states have what they call lemonade stand laws, which is something that you're talking about, that essentially say, hey, kids can run a lemonade stand, right? This is good for them. This is a great way to spend time, and it builds good habits, right? I think about 12 states have those, so they're common enough, not nearly as common as they should be. Senate Bill 145 in Missouri takes this one step further. It recognizes that kids are a unique source of creativity and have the resources now. They have skill with technology and they can provide all kinds of things that we didn't even know we needed before to make our world a better place. Senate Bill 145 exempts businesses owned by someone under 18 from local licensing and registration. So they're still licensing at the state level, but it's just one step to make the process a little bit easier on kids.
And let's talk about why is it important that young people get the opportunity to dip their toes in that entrepreneurial pool early on.
Yes, well, because kids become adults, first of all. That's probably the most essential thing. The kids who are having the opportunity to build a real business. And there are a lot out there. I mean, I tried to start a couple of businesses in my younger days. I know that there are a lot of people who have great ideas and are really eager to go beyond the lemonade stand and try to build something for their own. And what we see is this carries on into adulthood. 25% of people in the 18 to 25 age group consider themselves an entrepreneur. So again, they're carrying these habits forward. And if we can encourage these habits, we're going to encourage better business.
Let's take a moment here and kind of contrast the entrepreneur mindset versus the employee mindset. Um, I have long believed that largely our schools, even sometimes our institutions of higher learning, really kind of gear us towards being employees. So someone graduates, they get their degree, they're looking for someone to give them a job. What's the difference between them and someone who is an entrepreneur?
Absolutely. And I agree completely. We see in a lot of our schools that we are building this employee mindset, running off of bells. You have a lunch break, largely running the same hours every day. And there's a place for that, and a lot of people will find value in that. The entrepreneurial mindset is also something we need though, because it's based on building things. The people who are building things are the ones who are creating those jobs in Missouri and anywhere, and they're the ones we need to keep driving our modern economy forward.
Yeah, look, I spent the majority of my adult life so far with an employee mindset. And it was only within the last decade or so that I've really stepped out into that entrepreneurial world. And the reason that I hesitated to do it was because it was scary. And I think that people want the security of a paycheck, regularly, and they don't want the uncertainty that comes with it. But there's something about that entrepreneurial process that makes even those efforts that fail worthwhile. Why is that?
Yes. So especially in the case of kids, I think the first thing is they are building incredibly valuable experience, right? Even if someone who's 15 now and starting a business isn't going to create the next Google and carry that on forever. Even in their failure, they're gaining new experiences. And I think The statistic is people who start their second business have something like 40% higher profits in their next one, something close to that. So it's just higher numbers, and that comes from experience. And when we're giving kids the unique opportunity to build this experience from a younger age, I think we'll see benefits at the state economic level and we'll see national benefits.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, something as simple as a kid who participates in, say, an entrepreneur fair, and they want to go sell, fidget spinners. That was the big thing here a few years ago. But they learn applied economics. I mean, they see economics in action. You mentioned this in your article. For instance, the market's discovery mechanism. They get to see how that works, so what needs there are out there, how to be better than the next guy at delivering those needs. Are there any other states taking a cue from Missouri to likewise remove some of those barriers that otherwise would keep young entrepreneurs from again dipping their toes in the water?
So I haven't seen any recently in the news. This bill passed on July 14th, so it's fairly new, but there's a group of, again, I think it's about 12 states. Yes, about 12 who have relatively looser laws compared to other states that allow kids to not have to apply if, for example, in Pennsylvania, if a business makes under $5,000 profits and is open for less than 87 days. And while laws like that are great, they are really just lemonade stand laws. What we are seeing from Missouri is that they are giving kids the opportunity to participate in a modern economy and contribute to the world around them. And I think that's a fantastic thing.
Does this also have the effect of moving the attitudes of regulators and legislators toward maybe perhaps being a little less controlling? I'm thinking, for instance, I think it was the state of Utah a few years back created what was called a regulatory sandbox, which essentially, if you wanted to start up a new business, it was assumed that you were going to operate, without the need for heavy regulation. And I thought that was really a smart way to do things because that the regulation is what keeps a lot of entrepreneurs, young and old, out of the market.
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you about the burdens that some localities and states are putting on people in starting businesses. I think you're right. It was Utah that had the regulatory sandbox. So I agree. I think heavy regulation is keeping a lot of people out of the markets. I think kids are a fantastic place to start, but I would encourage states to move forward and see the positive effects of this and give everyone the chance to participate in it eventually.
Okay, so Brayden, let me ask you this: for those states that seem hesitant to loosen some of the rules or the barriers that prevent young entrepreneurs from coming into the market, what's the excuse that they give for why we need, this level of law or regulation?
As for the kids in particular, I would say there's a fairness element of things. You can talk about the benefits of regulations and whatnot, and that's a whole different story. I understand the argument saying that any business should participate in the same sandbox. We can't give a competitive advantage. But again, this is our future we're talking about, and I think it's reasonable to let them try to have a leg up and build something of their own. As to the regulations themselves, again, there's a safety concern. That's the main thing we talk about. I don't want to be drinking goat milk from someone who I don't I don't know where they found this goat. But the point is there's a lot of validity in those concerns. And the truth of the matter is if a business fails and endangers its customers, it is just as liable whether it is from a child or an adult. It is just as responsible to the laws and rules of our country. But what we shouldn't do is create this first barrier that is going to stop kids from entering the market to begin with.
Again, we are talking with Brayden Myers. He's a contributor with Young Voices and a student of economics at the University of Alabama. Brayden, where can people follow you or where can they find you on social media?
Yes, most recently I've been posting all of my articles on LinkedIn. That's just Brayden Myers, and that's the best place to find me.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're happy to welcome Mike Fox to the program. Mike is a Young Voices contributor, and I gather you wear a few other hats as well. Take a moment, tell us about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for having me. My name is Mike Fox. I am a legal fellow at the Cato Institute's Project on Criminal Justice, and we focus on a number of key issue areas there, primarily overcriminalization, police accountability, plea bargaining, the historic conception of jury trials, both of which sort of come into play with this piece. And then I also have done a lot of work recently on due process and other areas of constitutional law and how Constitution prohibits law enforcement from encroaching upon people's rights, despite the fact that either the legislature, the courts, or the executive branch don't seem to understand that.
Yeah, I'm looking at this article here in Counterpunch, The Price of Justice When Liberty Becomes a Bribe. And I'll admit, I haven't really thought about it from this angle, but you talk in here about how when prosecutors offer freedom in exchange for cooperation, justice becomes a bargaining chip rather than, the end goal of why we have a justice system in the first place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you look, we don't have reliable state level data, but at the federal system, 98.3% of cases are the result, or criminal convictions result from plea bargains. States is probably somewhere in the 94 to 97% range. So that means, on average, about 95, 96 out of every 100 people who are convicted of a crime plead guilty. And that is despite the fact that the only right that appears in both the unamended text of the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights, which would be Article 3 in the Sixth Amendment, is the right to a jury trial. And the framers well understood, having lived under British subjugation, why having a jury of your peers was so fundamental. And yet now most people don't use it; they'll forgo it altogether. And I'm happy to discuss why that is.
Let's talk specifically. Let's put a name to this. Some people will recognize the name Kilmar Abrego Garcia. For those who don't know who he is, fill us in.
Yeah, so Kilmar Abrego Garcia was one of several people who was abducted by the Trump administration and renditioned to a foreign country. In this case, it was El Salvador. And when they brought him back, ultimately after a battle that played out in federal courts for a few months, he suddenly was charged with a crime. They allege that this crime went back, I believe it was 2022, so 3 years. If this was such a serious crime, I really don't understand why they never even contemplated prosecuting him until they were sort of, had something hanging over his head. Typically if someone is engaged in a really serious crime, you would want to prosecute them and get them off the streets right away, not, use it for political gamesmanship. But that seems to be exactly what's going on here. And, notably, the key witness against Mr. Abrego Garcia is a man named Jose Ramon Hernandez Reyes. And, Mr. Reyes is not just a random individual who, happened to have witnessed some alleged crime committed by Abrego Garcia. He himself is I believe, a 3-time felon who is eligible for deportation. Suddenly, he wants to sing and help the government. Guess where he's no longer in? He's not in prison anymore. He's now in a halfway house. He was supposed to be deported when he was released from prison, and now they're allowing him to stay at least for a year. So Mr. Hernandez Reyes has every incentive to testify against Mr. Abrego Garcia, regardless of whether or not that's true. Whether Abrego Garcia actually committed the crime they allege, I don't know. If he did, whether Hernandez Reyes witnessed it, I have no idea. But frankly, that doesn't matter. All that matters is that he's willing to say something, benefits himself, benefits the government. They get what they want without any regard for whether or not it's actually true.
And you're speaking here as a former public defender when you say that this sounds a lot like a bribe. The way that they're cutting these deals.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, like, if I was a defense attorney and I had a hostile witness who I didn't want to have testify against my client, and I offered to pay that witness to not show up to trial, I would absolutely be prosecuted, and I should be, right? That's not how the justice system is supposed to work in this country. Of course, there's only one thing that's more valuable than money, and that's freedom. And prosecutors get to bribe people with freedom all the time. There was a woman in the late 90s named Sonia Singleton who actually argued this and said that, the prosecutors were bribing the witnesses against her. And she managed to convince a panel in the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, which sits in Denver. And that was a landmark ruling, which I think is correct. unfortunately, the Justice Department, lost their mind because heaven forbid they actually have to try cases to a jury and lose some of the leverage they have in coercing people to plead guilty. There were bipartisan conversations on Capitol Hill amongst Congress as to, what to do here. But really, what the law at issue is called, federal bribery statute, and it says that, paying a federal official constitutes bribery. There is no, plain reading of the statute that would imply that prosecutors are not federal officials. They work for the federal government. They're federal agents. There's no carve out in the statute. So as Congress was going back and forth as to whether or not to create a carve out, the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit decided to sit en banc, which means the entire court rather than a 3-judge panel. And the court, on its own volition, decided that, well, that statute couldn't possibly have meant to cover prosecutors, despite the fact that it doesn't have any type of, statutory language that says that. And because of that, the ruling effectually says prosecutors aren't people for the purposes of the statute. That's just insane. Anyone with a functioning brain would know that's not right.
No, you make the case here, I think, very well in your article. And you also share the example of Walter McMillan. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, so Walter McMillan is a well-known name. There was a movie and a documentary and a book called Just Mercy that was written partly about Mr. McMillan's case. And the reason I bring up Mr. McMillan is he was another individual. Mr. McMillan spent 6 years on death row. And there was a man named Ralph Myers who had an extensive criminal history. I believe Mr. Myers was actually accused of another murder where he was eligible for the death penalty. And he was told that if he testified against Mr. McMillan, that would spare him his life. Now, mind you, Mr. Myers didn't even know Mr. McMillan, let alone was he a witness to any crime that Mr. McMillan committed, which we now know Mr. McMillan actually did not even commit the crime, right? And, even Mr. Myers, got uncomfortable with what was going on. And he told, I forget if it was like the Alabama Bureau of Investigation or something like that, that he was, that it wasn't true. And they said, well, it doesn't matter. You just got to do it anyway. So he wound up testifying against Mr. McMillan, despite the fact that he was completely making it up and Mr. McMillan never even committed the crime. The issue here was Mr. Myers could either, be sentenced to death or he could testify against McMillan. And frankly, that's a hard decision to make because, a lot of times we'll get asked, why would people ever plead guilty to something they didn't do? And well, if you're a parent and you have your kids growing up, and let's say you get an offer to plead guilty for a year when you got 30 years hanging over your head if you go to trial and lose. Yeah, that's how that happens. And frankly, the Innocence Project has done studies. They've exonerated people with DNA evidence, and they found that there's a percentage of people who've actually pled guilty to crimes that they did not commit. And these aren't like minor crimes like shoplifting. These are horrific crimes, murder, sexual assault. And, it's really upsetting.
Well, as you point out in the article, you take the case of the Singleton decision and what happened with Walter McMillan, and this is what it looks like when prosecutors offer leniency in exchange for testimony, which sounds a lot like, now, if you'll just toe this line, wink, wink, we'll make it worth your while. It sounds very shady.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's bribery in every sense of the word. The statute is unequivocally clear. I think Congress ought to change the statute and make it clear that prosecutors are bound by the law. And that, if the government wants to convict someone, it takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and we're asking 12 citizens to step, away from their lives. So it better be something important and worthwhile.
All right. Again, we are talking with Mike Fox. Mike, I know that there's a lot to, any legal issue for people who want to get their mind around this subject better. What do you recommend in terms of resources they might access?
Yeah, so my colleagues and I at Cato have actually done an extensive amount of writing and work on issues ranging from plea bargaining to overcriminalization to the role of juries. So I would go on our website, cato.org, and see what we have there, and also follow us on Twitter.
Okay, and that was my next question is, where can people find you and follow you on social media?
Yeah, sure. So they can find me on Twitter, and I am at FoxMike90. So FoxMike90.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Brian.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today, and we're happy to welcome Edward Newson to the program. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Edward, since this is our first time meeting you, please take a moment to tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Hi, so my name's Ted Newson. I started off with Young Voices about a month ago. I've got a few articles published, but I'm looking to break more into the media, get some more articles out there with more prestigious outlets, and I'm very happy to be here today.
Well, I'm looking at an article that you've written for 1828.org.uk. Britain's illegal tobacco problem is out of control. And I have talked with a number of Young Voices contributors over the years who have shared their thoughts and shared some of the facts on the attempts to discourage use of tobacco in Britain. And so I would love for those who aren't familiar with the lengths to which your government is going to try to reduce people smoking, give us some examples about some of the policies that they have embraced.
Well, Brian, the British government has effectively banned disposable vapes. They're looking to ban cigarettes if you were born after the year 2009, I believe. And so really, that's a massive reduction of personal liberty, and the state has got involved in somewhere which should really be a personal responsibility. On the back of every cigarette pack in Britain, it says, "Smoking kills, please quit." And if you don't think that's enough symmetry of information, either it's completely daft. And to think that the state can just get involved, poke its nose in where it really shouldn't, and ban it outright, that's totally ridiculous.
Well, it sounds as though the government has also put the squeeze on smokers through raising the taxes on tobacco, but that's had some unintended consequences, hasn't it?
Well, quite right. So essentially, 80% of the price of a packet of tobacco these days is only in tax, which, as a headline figure, is totally ridiculous. But going forward onto that, it incentivizes black marketeers to either illegally bring tobacco from other countries into Britain or to even counterfeit it themselves. And the problem with counterfeiting is there's no regulation in that at all. So first of all, the state isn't getting any money, they're not raising any tax revenue, but also the chemicals involved with the production of these cigarettes, which were often made in China, Russia, Eastern Europe, are completely unregulated. I've heard reports of people packing these cigarettes with sawdust even, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
So this comes back to a desire to keep people from engaging in a vice. And I love that in your article, you get right into this desire to stamp out undesirable habits in others. Talk to me about how you can be against these heavy-handed policies, but at the same time, you're not actively promoting that people go out and in other words, you're not working for the tobacco industry. You're not encouraging people to go out there and use it. You can acknowledge that it's dangerous, but also say, this is really not a place where the government should be exerting itself to force people into a type of behavior.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, personally, I don't smoke. I've got plenty of friends who do smoke, and to them, it's nothing more than a personal choice. And with that in mind, I don't think the government should be getting involved and completely removing freedom of choice from someone's ability to do something. And the real problem with this is I've had friends who have told me about the difference in taste between a legal cigarette and an illegal cigarette, and banning tobacco entirely and discouraging the use of vaping is only going to widen this industry, which has already lost the government £1.7 billion in tax receipts. So it's really a bit of an own goal from the British government to say, let's ban this, because all it does is open the door for a black marketeer to make even more money.
If only there were some historical precedent that they could look to where a substance was banned, say alcohol in the US, and yet the consequences, in fact, showed it did not reduce alcohol consumption, but actually created a huge black market. Oh, yeah, that's right. We did go through that not quite 100 years ago.
Completely. I mean, alcohol prohibition in the States is a prime example of where this doesn't work. All it did was drive up prices of alcohol for the poorest consumers, and it made it unregulated. So really, even though maybe drink abuse deaths went down, drinking, some people were drinking paint thinner. It was ridiculous. The fact that the entire market was unregulated essentially opened up society to massive harms courtesy of the black market. And if Britain doesn't reverse this decision, it's going to face itself in a very similar situation.
Now, I have to ask you this, Ted. You're not advocating for a complete lack of regulation on tobacco, are you?
Well, no, I'm not. I think tobacco ought to be regulated, and this is exactly why the black market's a bad thing, because that's when tobacco is completely unregulated. I think taxes on cigarettes are far too high because essentially they price out people from smoking, and they almost while they're intended to dissuade people from smoking, they are prohibitively expensive, which opens up a door to the black market, which is often half the price or even more so than the legal cigarettes. So really, if you look at basic economics, such as the Laffer curve, you can realize that you can tax something too much, and actually rolling back on that is going to increase the amount of legal tobacco that's sold in Britain and consumed, which is ultimately good for the government, good for tax receipts, and good for society as a result.
So the idea of banning tobacco outright, you say in your article, that is a bad idea for the reasons that you've just given, as well as another reason, and that is if we concede that, well, it's unhealthy, therefore the state needs to step in and make it illegal or, do everything they can to discourage it, where does that end? I mean, it could very easily be expanded from things that are more obvious, like use of tobacco, to things like food or drink.
Well, this is exactly right. And I was talking about this the other day. When you set the precedent of banning something that could potentially have health consequences years down the line, all you're going to see is, well, you're going to see regulation of junk food. You're going to see regulation of pubs. You're going to see regulation of any kind of hospitality or nutrition-based sector that could potentially have harms far in the future. I think when it comes to this, initially tobacco was regulated because there was a harm people didn't know about, and that was lung cancer and certain other cancers. Now that's very, very well known in Britain right now. There is no asymmetry of information. So to ban it entirely is sheer lunacy.
Well, it appears to substitute the force of government for the reason of the individual, who really should be the one making the decision, yes or no. I want to smoke or I don't.
Exactly. It's a personal decision. People understand the consequences of smoking, but if they get some enjoyment and they're willing to make the sacrifice to their health for a short-term bit of fun or a cigarette at the pub, I say let them. They put in far too much tax into the system through revenues, through cigarette taxes. They put in an awful lot of saved money into the system through not claiming their pension, as statistically they do die earlier. So I think if you want to make the personal decision to smoke, you should absolutely be able to smoke without the government getting involved and the nanny state hampering your ability to do so.
I like how you put it. We should let the government get on with solving real health crises in the country, but leave the smokers the right to smoke. Very well stated.
Completely. When you're talking about problems in this country, obesity is a massive issue, but no one has ever told me about banning every kind of junk food and only allowing organic food on our shelves. So to suggest that kind of precedent, that's silly.
Once again, we are talking with Ted Newson. He is a political commentator with Young Voices UK. Where can people find you on social media and follow your work?
So on Twitter, I am Newson Ted, NEWSONTED. On Instagram, I'm Ted_Newson04.